So today we're going to talk about another of the types of commercial real estate buildings. And what is an industrial real estate building?
Oh gosh, well, an industrial building is one where all kinds of industries take place. So it could be an assembly plant, it could be a warehouse, it could be what we sometimes call smash repairs or panel beating or collision repair for vehicles. It could just be storage. It's where any industrial operation, a paint shop where they might have all kinds of extraction equipment so that the people operating the equipment don't get affected too much by the fumes there. Anything that's got an industrial operation.
That's right. And so tell us, have you ever invested in any of these types of buildings?
Oh, yes. No, I've got warehouses and storage facilities. They're really good. They're good for many reasons.
Oh, tell us.
Well, firstly, they can't be beaten up. They often don't need to look very good. They're just a concrete pad with 4 walls. It might be tilt slab concrete or concrete block construction, and then a roof that is impenetrable by the elements, and that's all they need, in essence. So you don't need to go for a particularly good looks. You don't need to modernize an industrial building to make it appealing to the tenant the way a hotel or a motel needs to be modernized, or even a commercial retail space needs to be modernized every now and then. So you don't have that.
So how do you go about getting one of these types of tenants? Because, I mean, they are companies. So how do you reach out to those companies so they can be your tenants on your building?
Well, interesting question, because that's the biggest fear amongst people who own many kinds of commercial real estate, especially industrial. I've had a vacant industrial building, a vacant warehouse, in a sea of similarly vacant warehouses. And people have said, well, you've got a problem there. No one can get a tenant. And I'll say, oh, I'll get a tenant within a month. And they'll grin at me and say, yeah, likely story. And then they sit back and watch. Well, they can't see much during that month, because what I do is, well, firstly, let me explain this. Who ends up deciding whether to lease our vacant warehouse from us? Is it going to be the coffee or tea man or woman who makes coffee and tea in the afternoons? No. Is it going to be the president of the company whose head office is in Los Angeles or New York or Paris or Berlin? No. It's going to be the manager who's going to manage that warehouse. So what I want to do is appeal to that manager. And I appeal to him by taking the manager's office and turning it into the most salubrious manager's office that anyone has ever seen. So I go in there, and usually they've got linoleum on the floor, right, lino. I replace that with commercial grade carpet. They've got old incandescent bulbs. I replace it with the latest in LED technology. I replace the single glazed windows with either double, or even better still, triple glazed or triple paned windows. It keeps the noise of the industrial area out. During the winter, it can keep the place warm, and in the summer, it keeps it cool. I put in a 60-inch LCD TV screen and tell everyone it's good for corporate training videos. And we all know they're not going to watch corporate training videos on the screen, but we've given him a good line that he can use to tell his manager why he leased our building. I put in a coffee machine and have it brewing in case they like coffee. I put in a little bar fridge in the corner where they can keep drinks cool for the end of week celebration that they've had a good week. And I think you get the picture. Put in contemporary furniture or beautiful oak furniture or something like that. So what happens is our manager, looking for space for his company, he's looked at 8 equally boring and dull, ugly warehouses already. And then he comes to our ugly, boring, and dull warehouse, but he opens the door to the manager's office and he takes one peek inside. And whether we like it or not, Marjorie, he's going to think to himself subconsciously, holy smoke, if we lease this building, this is where I will be seated for 40 hours a week for the next Lord knows how many years. And he says, we'll take it. And he hasn't even asked the rental level. Now, you might think that's bribery and corruption. I don't think it is. I think it's just meeting the market with what the market wants. If there's a demand for that, let's fill that demand. If there's a demand for places with nicer managers' offices, then why not? I used to spend up to $10,000 to do this, but the price has come down. The cost of a 60-inch LCD screen has come down. And by the way, I forgot to mention, I also replace all the locks from old mechanical locks where you can lose the keys, which causes 2 problems. One is you lose them, you can't get in. Secondly, the finder of the keys now has access to your innermost sanctum, the manager's office. So we're replacing them with electronic locks, either combination code activated or fingerprint activated, or better still, face recognition technology. They can never lose their keys, which means they're never locked out. And it just feels more modern. It feels with it. Most people haven't experienced that. And I'll never forget, just as an analogy, the first hotel I went to that had facial recognition technology, not only for access to your own room, but access to parts of the hotel where only guests who were booked overnight could go, versus the bars and the restaurants where members of the public could go. And it was out of all places in Jakarta, Indonesia. I still remember it, and I thought, wow, these guys are with it. I want to stay here again, over a silly little thing like door access. So yes, we've had great success with our industrial buildings by making them more appealing to the very people who are going to make the decision as to whether to rent them or not.
That's right. And I feel like it doesn't take that much effort. It's just the tiny little details that these managers are going to be looking for that are truly going to make a huge difference in the market. So my question for you now is like, in the case of these industrial buildings, what are some of the repairs that we have to consider when purchasing one of this?
Well, the only thing that the landlord is really responsible for when it comes to industrial buildings is they're being sealed against the elements. So they have to be watertight. When it rains, they're not allowed to leak. If it rains and the industrial building does leak, it's the landlord's responsibility to fix it. But that's about the extent of the landlord's responsibility. Everything else about that industrial building is really handled by the tenants.
So even if it's, let's say, a refrigeration type of industrial building, do the tenants also get to do all of those modifications to the building?
Yes, it depends on the lease, of course, but very often I've had tenants who have leased a vacant industrial building and they wanted it refrigerated, so they provide the refrigeration walls. You line the walls with a very thermally insulative material, and they provide the equipment, and then it's their equipment and they keep it going. Now, usually when they leave, they don't take the equipment with them. They've got their sights on something else. It's not worth as much to them. It's so difficult to move. You've got to disconnect the tubes that have the refrigerant in it. You lose a lot of refrigerant. That's an expense. So they tend to leave it there, and then I'll lease it out to the next group of tenants. But I say you're responsible for its maintenance.
Oh, interesting. And the cool thing is that you already have one new set of improvements on the building that you can literally use for increasing the amount of rent that you're going to be charging to these new tenants.
Oh, absolutely, yes. Anything you do to a building to increase its desirability increases its rental level.
So are these types of repairs, so let's say that you had an industrial building and then you have a tenant, he made it into a refrigerant kind of building, would that also add the value of the building?
Well, the more specialized it is, the more the rent you can usually get. So a refrigerated building will rent for more than a standard building that's not refrigerated. Just like a building with an air conditioning plant on it. Forget about refrigeration, like keeping it below 0 degrees Celsius. But a building with air conditioning, which you need in the likes of Phoenix, as a matter of course, but it will have a higher rental value per square foot or per square meter than a building that doesn't have those facilities. So yeah, they're worth more.
And what about with the mortgage side of things? Let's say with the bank, would they add more value to the mortgage that you have?
Well, any appraiser will appraise the building as being a more valuable building if it's got extra features, like refrigeration. So it will appraise for more, which means you can borrow more money against it. The interest rate should be about the same. It's an industrial building. But you'll get more rental from it, absolutely.
Oh, cool. And what are some of the things that we should consider when looking at an industrial building? What are some of the red flags that we need to avoid?
Well, with anything, when it comes to real estate, you want to buy a building that has good demand. So I've never recommended buying vacant buildings, even though I look for vacant buildings. You might say, aren't you saying two different things? No. I don't like buying vacant buildings because at the end of the day, the only justification I have for having commercial real estate is to have a tenant. I need cash flow. Something without cash flow is not an investment. That is why in my world, buying gold does not constitute that you're making an investment. You are speculating that the price of gold will go up and that you can sell it for more. The only thing that qualifies as an investment is something that generates income. So by that definition, a vacant building doesn't generate income. It's not an investment. It's a liability. You have to pay property tax. But if you can find a vacant building and before buying it can finagle a way of getting a tenant, then you can add value, because with the building being empty, you might be able to pick it up for $500,000. It's got residual land value and residual building value. But the act of putting a tenant in there might make the value worth $1 million. So you've now got a building worth $1 million, and even if the bank only lends you 50% of the valuation to buy that, that's $500,000. That's what you're paying for it. So, in a nutshell, that's how I've made most of my money in commercial real estate. I have looked for vacant or semi-vacant buildings. Before buying it, I figure out a way of getting a tenant. With a tenant signed up on a heads of agreement or an LOI, letter of intent, I then go ahead and buy the building. I get the appraisal done based on having the tenant there. The bank lends me 50-60% of that building, and that covers my purchase price.
Oh, interesting.
And then when it doubles in value, I get the benefit of that doubling, not the bank, because the value of the mortgage stays the same, even though the value of the property has doubled in value.
So you keep owing the same amount of money, but like now your building is way more valuable than what you had
Right.
it, when you purchased it.
And as the building keeps on going up in value, I refinance and pull out more money and use that as a down payment on the next building.
Oh, that's
if it
really
needs a
interesting.
down payment. Yeah.
That's for sure. So tell us, what are some of the advantages of owning an industrial building?
Well, the main advantage of industrial over any other form of commercial building is that there's lower maintenance. They don't tend to care so much about whether the paint is flaking off on that back wall, because they run an industrial operation there, so they don't really care about that. And if they do want the wall painted, they tend to paint it themselves. They tend to be very low maintenance. You'll hear from your industrial tenants very seldom.
Oh, interesting. And you also mentioned that besides having warehouses, also storage units can be considered into the industrial real estate area. Have you ever had any experiences with having some storage units and renting them?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, in Australia, I have built hangars, which is airplane storage facilities. And when you think about it, an airplane hangar is quite simple. It's a concrete slab. You've got 4 walls. It's usually not even tilt slab concrete. They're often metal walls, corrugated sheeting or something like that. And then you want a roof, and then you've got these big doors up front, hangar doors, which can open up so that an entire plane can enter or leave. And here's the interesting thing, Marjorie. I would be collecting double the rental of my competitors at these airports by doing one simple little thing. And I'd talk about it, I'd advertise it, I'd write about it in books, I'd talk about it in podcasts like this, and I very seldom find anyone else who emulates this. And so to figure out how I get double the rental from my aircraft hangars that everyone else does, the first question I would pose you is, what do people store in aircraft hangars? It's kind of a trick question because the answer is embedded in the question. But do they store old tax records there? No, it's an aircraft hangar. Right. They store aircraft there. It might be, a $13 million Gulfstream 650 or a $45 million Global Explorer 1550. They're expensive things they keep there. So the owners want to know that their things being stored are safe. So I put in an IP camera. It's an internet protocol camera. It's a camera that you can watch through the internet. And then I have a hydrometer and a thermometer and a barometer there, so that by using the pan function, they can check the temperature and the air pressure and the humidity to make sure their baby, the plane, is nice and safe. If a door opens or a light switch is turned on or something like that happens, a photo gets taken and sent to the owner automatically. They can then tunnel in and watch the video feed live of what's going on in that hangar. And to do that, the camera might cost these days $100 for a really good one, and the internet access is $25, $50 a month for the entire cluster of hangars you might have there. So the cost of providing this is negligible. And yet I get double the rental because they want to make sure that their 13 or whatever $1 million baby is safe.
And it automatically added the value to what you had on your building, because it was just a tiny little camera that can allow the owners to actually have control of what's going on in their hangars.
Right. And interestingly, when banks decide how much they'll lend you against a building, they don't add up the value of that camera there. They don't care whether there's a camera there or not. They want to look at the rental value. And if I'm getting double the rental value of my competitors, then they cap out that rental value to arrive at the building value, and they'll borrow against that. They'll lend money against that. So it increases the value of my building by way beyond the cost of that IP camera.
That's interesting. What other tiny little adjustments have you done to your industrial buildings to make sure that they increase on their value?
Well, you mentioned storage facilities, for instance. A lot of storage facilities have an on-site manager because invariably people lose their keys or they need to get in and they don't want them using bolt cutters or something. So they have on-site managers, or there is a key management problem. So what I've done is I've replaced a lot of the key systems with electronic keys where you punch in a number. But here's the thing, the number works or doesn't work depending on whether their rent is up to date. Now, you can't do this on a home because you can't have a mother come back to the house where she's got 3 babies, and because the monthly rent period has come to an end, she can't get into the house. That wouldn't be good.
Yeah, no.
But with an industrial building, you can. So we would have a situation where someone wants to go to their storage unit, it's the 8th of the month, and their credit card didn't clear for that month's rent. So their code doesn't work. And they call you, and in amongst all the expletives that they might use, they say, this stinking thing doesn't work and I need to get to my stuff. And I'll say, well, let me look it up, or the manager does. And we say, well, no, your credit card didn't clear for this month. The rent hasn't been paid. Well, I just need to get my stuff and then I'm out of here. So, well, okay, well, you're the 13th of the month now. So if you pay for this month, well, you can do that. Well, let me in. And so, well, we can't. I physically can't unless the credit. Okay. And then they put in a new credit card, it's expired or something, and then it works. So it sort of did a number of things. A side benefit was it guaranteed rental payment because without paying, they can't get access.
That's right.
But more importantly, it reduced the need to have on-site management because now it's all automated. So again, it's just a matter of thinking outside the box. What else can we do to make this more appealing than it otherwise would be? What can we do that the competition isn't doing?
So tell us, when investing in an industrial type of building, what are some other things that you look for on location-wise for that building?
Well, the great thing about industrial, especially storage, if that's what you're talking about, is it doesn't need to be particularly well located because people don't go there every day for work. They might go to a storage facility 3 times when they get it to put stuff there, or 5 or 8 times, but then they mightn't go there for 2 months. And then on average, they might go every second month just to add something to their pile of junk they're keeping or take something away or as the case may be. So you can't have it, 100 miles from anywhere, but it doesn't need to have really great access. So you can put storage facilities in places that are perhaps not suitable for retail outlets or a gas station or a warehouse or something like that, where they need more constant access. It just depends.
And can you turn any building into an industrial type of building, or is there any sort of regulations that you have to follow?
Well, every kind of building that you want to locate somewhere has to conform to local zoning rules. So depending on how much noise is made at the industrial location, that will cripple whether you can put it close to a residential area. Panel beating, what do we call them here, where they have collision repairs? Cars been in an accident and they beat the panels out to make them good again. They tend to be quite noisy. And so there are more restrictions on those than, say, an accountant's office, which tends to be a very quiet operation. So it just depends, and that's why you've got all these different kinds of zoning in place. But you can always apply for a change of zoning. And
how does that work, really? Because, for example, let's say that I have a building and I want to turn it into a storage unit. How do you go about changing that zoning from that house into a industrial building in this case?
So philosophically, there are 2 ways of looking at the people who enact and enforce the zoning rules. One is you can say they are a pompous set of bureaucrats who've never made it successfully in their own private entrepreneurial world. So they like to wield power over people and deny them every request. That's one attitude that isn't always countered by reality. But there's another attitude, and that is that city councils all over the world want to generate revenue. And they generate revenue through property taxes and sales taxes. Sometimes it's called GST or PST or VAT, depending on which country and jurisdiction you're in. And often they can get more revenue. For instance, from hotels, they can charge a hotel room occupancy tax. And you'll often see that added to a bill. So they have a vested interest in keeping buildings occupied. And we had a hotel in Atlanta, for instance, Atlanta, Georgia, which had reached the end of its natural useful life. It had outlived its usefulness as a hotel room. So we applied to have the zoning change from whatever they needed for a hotel to turn it into a storage facility, because being a hotel and an older hotel, it was already compartmentalized into small rooms which had concrete walls between. It was perfect as a storage facility. So in the case of that, the city council was no longer receiving revenue from the normal operation, from all the room occupancy. So anyone that came up with an idea that would give it some kind of revenue generation capability for the council would often be met with their approval. They want to do things to increase their revenue.
That's right.
So that wasn't too difficult. Now, had it been on the main strip right opposite of Disneyland or something like that, they might have said, no, we don't want a storage facility there. It's ugly, too many trucks coming and going, loading. But if it's in a nondescript part of town that they don't worry about too much, every case on its own merit, Marjorie. That's why the greatest thing you can be with real estate is flexible. And don't have too many preconceived notions. Don't think you can learn everything you need to implement in real estate by listening to these podcasts. Rather, I'd like to think that these podcasts make you think, well, if that goofy guy can do it with this thing or with that thing, I can too do it with whatever cluster of buildings I've got. It's a matter of thinking outside the box. I always say, Marjorie, the most valuable piece of real estate is the 6 inches, give or take, between your right ear and your left ear, because it's what you create in that space that will ultimately determine your net worth.
I love that. And thank you so much for showing us all of these creative ways that you can truly invest into real estate and magnify the amount of income that you're receiving on any of the buildings that you get. Thank you so much again, Dolf. Always a pleasure to hear from your amazing stories.
My pleasure.
And thank you to our audience as well for hearing us. And stay tuned for our next episode.